So good evening, everyone, or good afternoon if you're in North America on the West Coast, or good middle of the night. We have a few people in Europe. I think we have one or two people in Australia, so I think it's 3 days ago there. So I'm Ethan Nichtern, and this is the launch of our 2019 Online Buddhist Studies course. I just wanted to share a little bit about the inspiration of this course. It's an 8-week course, also a 40-week course that meets both Tuesdays and Saturdays, and I think we all know that. And the Tuesday meetings are more primary lecture and guided meditation, which I'll often be giving with some little help from our faculty. And when we get into our second, third, and fourth courses, we'll have about 2 guest lectures per 8-week series. So that's really wonderful. And then our Saturday meetings are a slightly shorter meeting to get together to hear from one of the faculty, to practice meditation in line with the week's topic and meditation practices and readings, and also to discuss further as a group. And then for those of us who are joining the live course, which everybody on this call is, we also have this quad model, which I'll talk about a little later on in the evening. And then we also have people just auditing, following along the readings and recordings and doing their practice on their own. So the structure of this course really follows in more or less the general structure of the book that I wrote, The Road Home, an overview of the Buddhist path, which focuses primarily on the structure of Buddhist teachings from at least the conceptual framework of the Shambhala tradition, although we'll have teachers and readings and teachings from a variety of Buddhist traditions. So that's where we're going. And this first 8-week course is really a deep dive into the personal level of practice and the earliest arising of Buddhist teachings about why a human being would need to look at their own mind and would be inspired to do that in depth. And I was reflecting earlier today on sort of my own journey with this path, and how non-transcendental this path has been for me, of 25 years of practicing, really since the middle of high school, and now 17 years of teaching meditation and Buddhist studies and philosophy. I got myself into trouble once because with a friend of mine who practiced TM, which is a very awesome tradition, but I said, you may want to call Buddhist meditation non-transcendental meditation. Because I was just thinking about the effects of this path just on kind of mundane everyday life. Just recently being in this stressful, crazy world, especially here in the United States with our current political and social situations, dealing with being a working parent, just thinking about today's events. Our child care canceled on us because they were very sick, and got to watch my toddler daughter for 8 hours, but had to rearrange everything with a lot of excitement and nervousness about this course starting. I've been having pretty significant hip and back pain issues the past couple of weeks. It's January in New York City. A lot of us are suffering from various versions of seasonal affective stuff. And just thinking about handling all of that, and just contemplating, has my practice, all these years of practice, actually made me better able to handle just the mundane details of being alive, and with the stresses of being a person, in my case, a person of relatively great privilege in the modern world. And I think the answer is yes, in a very non-transcendental way. I remember one of my main mentors and teachers, Dr. Galen Ferguson, who's an Acharya or master teacher in the Shambhala tradition, once talking about just the basic practice of mindfulness of body, which we're going to do in a few minutes. Just taking a moment with his sort of very gentle sense of humor to say, you know, to a lot of people who want to meditate, who want to change their experience, the idea that we are stuck on earth in our bodies is a huge drag. We want to transcend, we want to go to astral planes, and yet that basis of being stuck on the earth in our bodies and having to deal with that is the basis of Buddhist awakening. So I don't think anyone here will get completely enlightened by early December when this 40-week course ends. But if you do, it probably means you are already quite close, or you know, I would wonder what you were signing up for the course for, because you're already pretty close. But I know a lot of you, and I know we have a really wonderful group of students, and I would just urge you to really take the approach of practicing just being with yourselves and being with your mind and being with your life a little more fully day by day and week by week. And the shift in perspective that occurs from that mundane, non-transcendental approach is incredibly profound. So it's really, you know, the fact that I get to offer this course, which people have been asking me to teach a online course again for a while, just to share a little bit of the context, is feels like quite a blessing, and is also coming out of a great deal of sadness. It's quite a blessing because it's really wonderful to take a deep dive into meditative practices and these Buddhist philosophical, psychological, ethical, spiritual teachings, and to really be able to focus with a group of people for an in-depth period of time on that feels like a great blessing. And the fact that technology, when it works, can bring us together across time and space feels like a blessing. It's also a real sadness because this is coming out of the spiritual center that I was the senior teacher in residence for from 2010 to 2018, the Shambhala Center of New York, closing its doors with a lot of the chaos and allegations of sexual abuse and assault in the Shambhala community, and for other reasons. And so it felt like 2019 was going to be a bit of a gap year in terms of how where the Dharma or where the Buddhist teachings are in the Western world, a gap year in terms of the Shambhala community, and sort of kind of feels like we're in a bit of a gap, and I'm using that term from the teachings on the 12 steps of karma, which we'll talk about in this first course. It feels like a gap in sort of the stream of the entire world right now in some ways, if I could speak very grandiosely for a minute, which I will sometimes do, and you'll have to reel me back in or say, hey man, that's a bit too broad of a statement. And so it feels like a good moment to just go with friends and comrades and students of good heart and say, let's really go deep. Let's go back to basics and let's build from there. So that's what this course is designed to do. The other thing I want to say before we do our first meditation session is that studying Buddhism is going to, and I'll talk about this in our lecture after we meditate, it's going to bring up a lot for us in terms of how we have studied other things in our life or how we've studied Buddhism before. It's going to bring up our sense of our habitual way of being a student, or how much we hated being a student before this, or how much we love geeking out about things. It's going to bring up a lot. And in a sense, the study and the ideas and the philosophy and the psychology of mind that evolved over 2,500 years is a little bit like the candy or the sort of sweet, that it's the carrot that gets us to meditate. So honestly, I think the point of this whole class, in a sense, is if our meditation practice becomes slightly more consistent because we have stuff to study and have conversations to have, that will be more than worth it, you know. So there's more to study than that, which I'll talk about later on. But I just want to say that if you've struggled with making your meditation practice consistent in the past, we're going to work on that in a reasonable way. Not in a, I'm going to now practice 3 hours a day, 7 days a week, and I haven't practiced. I practiced twice in the last 6 months, and now I'm going to practice 3 hours a day. That's just setting ourselves up for failure and self-punishment. And this is not required education, right? Most people on earth are not studying Dharma right now. So we should set ourselves up to actually enjoy ourselves and feel like we're progressing. So we're going to work with different meditation techniques. And the first one that we're going to work with, which is really in my tradition and in most Buddhist traditions that focus on meditation as a root and core practice, is the foundational level of practice, which in Sanskrit is called shamatha meditation. It's also just sometimes called mindfulness awareness meditation. So hopefully we'll get into understanding what those terms mean. For those of you who already have really strong Buddhist or meditative vocabularies, will be able to go deeper. And for those of you who are more new to all this, will be able to really get behind some of the terms that are thrown around quite often. But shamatha meditation is based in the foundation of mindfulness of body, and working with the breath as a way to anchor our minds and anchor our bodies, and work with what else is arising in our mind. So I'm going to lead us through a 4-step recipe of shamatha meditation. And the first thing I'm going to say is, because we're in this online space, whenever we do a guided meditation session during our classes, you may want to have a little reorientation in mind. I find it's a little weird to meditate facing a screen. If you don't find that it's weird to practice facing a screen, that's completely fine. But if you like to practice with your eyes open, a downward gaze, you may want to bring in sort of a meditative arrangement so you can turn away from the screen and get into a good position, and feel good about where you are before we start the meditation practice. So we're going to meditate in 1 minute. So take that minute to either let your day go for a moment, not let it go completely because that's impossible, but just let it be for a moment, or take that minute to arrange your seat. So either sitting on your cushion arrangement that you already have, or if you want to sit in a chair, to find the way that you want to face, and to sit in a chair so that your feet are flat on the ground. And either way, however you're sitting, the most important aspect is the arrangement of the spine, the range of the body from our pelvis and our sits bones up through the atlas of the spine and the skull sitting atop the spine. And to coin a phrase from Maho Kawachi, who's on our faculty, whenever we sit, we want to find a posture as best we can that feels, and this is the mantra of posture, upright but not uptight. There's so many ways in our life studying these teachings that we learn that there's a sweet spot, a really difficult sweet spot to find, where it tends to activate both our wisdom, both our awareness and our compassion. And that sweet spot is not too tight and not too loose. That's the other way that this is said. Like a finely tuned instrument. And we're being both gentle with ourselves and alert and precise at the same time. And if we go too far in either of those directions, if you get too precise, you tend to get very judgmental, sometimes obsessive, aggressive with yourself. And if you get too loose, sometimes you just get lethargic and spaced out, right? So where we are in different life situations, it changes what not too tight or not too loose means, right? On Sunday, when you're watching Netflix, not too tight, not too loose means something different from when you're at a meeting. But it's still there. And so the meditative posture, taking our seat, which is the first step of any meditative practice, is meant to embody in our house, our body, finding this. So find it for yourself. Okay. So legs are loosely crossed if they're crossed, and you always want to find enough elevation in your seat where your pelvis is arranged so that your knees come up no higher than your hip joints, preferably a little bit lower. And feel a sense of plugging into the cushion, the chair, the seat through your sits bones. And then just a little bit of length in the spine. Relaxing our shoulders. Relax your jaw. Sometimes we hold quite a lot of tension in our jaw. And just perhaps your chin is slightly tucked, more or less parallel with the ground, but sometimes the skull balances best atop the atlas of the spine when the chin is just slightly tucked inward, not so much to close off the throat. And as part of taking your seat, also decide what you want to do with your gaze. In some Buddhist traditions, including the Tibetan systems that I practice in, the Shambhala tradition that I'm a teacher in, mindfulness, awareness, meditation is practiced primarily with eyes open, but with a soft downward gaze. True of many Zen traditions as well. And then if you're more familiar with insight meditation, or if you often do a little bit of meditation in your asana yoga class, I find that in those environments, mindfulness awareness practices practice with the eyes gently closed. I'm going to encourage all of us to do which of those we are less comfortable with at some point. But tonight, do the one that you're more comfortable with. there's also a quality in taking our seat of just reconnecting with a sense of, this is a dangerous word for a Buddhist to say, but a sense of pride. Like, this is my spot and I belong here. And perhaps I come to my practice because I want to make a bit less of a mess in my spot on earth. And I want to help others a bit more from my spot on earth. And I want to enjoy my spot on earth. But this is my spot. And I can take that. I can take up the oxygen that I'm taking in. I can leave a mark on this seat or cushion. I belong here. So we'll do this more quickly, but all of that is taking your seat. And then there's just a moment, which can be brief at the end of a long day, to check in. Just notice the flavor or pace or texture of your mind right now. Maybe it's very busy. Maybe you're remembering something you forgot, and that's causing a bit of anxiety. Maybe it feels settled and at ease. So sometimes I like to ask myself the question, how am I? Just to see what's there, what I'll be working with. And as we get more and more familiar with a practice, we learn to navigate the technique slightly differently based on what state of mind we're bringing to it. So sometimes these first two steps are called preparing to meditate. And the third and fourth steps relate to the actual technique, the actual practice experience. So the actual technique begins when we decide, I'm going to begin placing my attention on my breath, my easeful breath. And I'll just ring the gong to note that we are all entering about a 10-minute period where that's our home base, the feeling of the body breathing in and out, wherever that sensation arises. Mindfulness of the body breathing. Perhaps it feels very easy to find your breath. That is more rare if you live in the modern world, generally. Perhaps it feels like the breath is like an idea. See if we can have a few moments where there's a sense of intimacy between our attention and the feeling of breath. Care, like you actually care about the sensation of breathing. And this is happening in the midst of a sensory environment. So you may be hearing subtle sounds. You may be seeing shapes and colors if eyes are open. And the sensory environment. And also the mental and emotional environment. And all of that can happen around this home base of the body breathing. But a moment may arise where you notice you're lost in thought. You are not with the breath. You are not in this meditation. You are in tomorrow. You're in yesterday. You're perseverating. You're singing song lyrics. Whatever it is. And this is where the awareness aspect comes in and becomes very strong. The fourth aspect of a shamatha recipe. So I always like to think of the technique of awareness, which is to gently note that the mind has wandered and then reconnect with the breath. That's the discipline aspect, to choose to come back. As one of my mentors, Sharon Salzberg, who will join us later in the year, like to say, always begin again. And that's the magic of practice. It cuts through any sense of judgment. And then there's the attitude of awareness, noticing the wanderings of the mind, noticing the energetic aspect of the mind. And here I always think of Mark Epstein and others using an idea from the very famous psychotherapist Winnicott about a good enough mother, one who is connected and does a good enough job being present with and steering the children. And awareness is like a good enough parent for the mind. Right? So the attitude is of love, actually. Even when your mind frustrates the hell out of you because it just dumped everything on the kitchen floor. That only happened to me a few times today with the actual person I'm parenting. Right? So just eruptions of thought or emotion or judgment. And awareness just says, okay, note that, and then back to the breath. So mindfulness is this gentle but precise placement of attention and the knowing that comes from that. And awareness is the contextual holding of our present moment experience with some discipline to recenter ourselves, but also with an attitude of care and love. So let's just practice mindfulness and awareness in silence together for 3 or 4 more minutes. And we'll begin to bring our shamatha meditation session to a close. Just taking a moment to acknowledge that you made it, that you showed up. Even if you're sitting in your bedroom right now, you still showed up to practice. And there can be a sense of self-gratitude. Even if your mind feels messy, that's okay. Just an acknowledgement that the effort was put in. And if you'd like to make any sort of physical gesture, such as a bow to yourself and your fellow practitioners, as the gong rings to close the session, please feel free. If you just want to make an internal acknowledgement of your practice, that's completely wonderful as well. Well, thank you all for that slightly broken session of shamatha. Adriana actually texted me, came across my screen that hadn't even noticed that I left. So clearly dealing with people who are deeply able to reach states of meditative concentration, so that's wonderful. Hopefully we'll have no more mishaps. So the next thing we're going to do is have the talk and discussion for the night. I'm going to just share a visual element. In terms of the microphones, just want to get that out of the way. We've now set it up just now so that everybody's muted, but you can unmute yourself, which should be in the bottom left corner of your screen. There's a microphone looking icon next to a video looking icon that turn on your mic and your video respectively. So when you are not speaking, when you are speaking, you want to hit the mic button so that there's not a red line through it. And when you're not speaking, you want to turn your mic off. Otherwise, it's going to pick up 119 people's sound. And that's where the cacophony happened a little bit earlier. So, so just a little note about that. So our first topic of conversation for this 8-week course is, in addition to establishing mindfulness practice and establishing how we're going to be working together, our first topic of conversation is just what it means to be a student, really. I find that, how to say this? It's interesting when you have a thought to say, and there's one way to say it that opens up a can of worms, and another way to say it that's maybe a little bit too simplistic, but I'll go the more simplistic route. I find that it's really good to understand what the process of being a student is that we are trying to go through. And so I'm going to try to share on the screen our main topic for the night. I don't know what you are you seeing the document that I intended, which says at the top the 3 aspects of prajna?
Yes.
Okay, thank you very much. I don't know if there are I have a few other Word documents up, so I don't know if you're seeing those. You're just seeing the 3 aspects of prajna, yes?
Yes.
Okay. Great. So just a note about language. There are multiple Buddhist languages. For those of us who are feeling a little bit geekier, which I always am, I feel like I was born too early because when I was in high school in the mid-1990s, if you called someone a nerd or a geek, it was an insult, and now it just means they're really into what they're studying. So I think somebody is drawing lines across the screen, which I don't know how to stop that, but that's pretty cool. We're going to geek out slightly, or at least the faculty will a little bit, with giving you some Buddhist terms in their original language, obviously transliterated into English and probably mispronounced. And the reason for doing that is not just to geek out, it's also that there's so many books and readings about in the mindfulness movement and in Buddhist and Buddhist applied thought that use Buddhist terms in translation. So somebody will say something like mindfulness or mindful awareness or present time awareness. And when one teacher says present time awareness, do they mean the same thing as when another teacher says mindfulness? Or when one person says love, do they mean the same thing as when another teacher says loving kindness? Or does compassion mean to this person, etc.? What does insight mean? And so I find that it's very useful to have some of the original language terminologies in our mind, so that we sort of can start to say like, oh, that's what that word means, or this is how I have come to understand that word, or this is how my translation seems to work the best. This is how I resonate with that. So there are various languages that Buddhism uses. Because my tradition is a Tibetan tradition, sometimes when we're working with a Tibetan teaching, I might give, like the three aspects of prajna, I might give Tibetan words in English transliteration that go along with the teaching, just for those of us who want to have them or geek out a little bit. There's two main languages of Buddhist thought. The earliest teachings were eventually written down 250 years after the Buddha died in what was called Pali Bhasa, or Pali for short, which literally means something like the language of the texts. And this, if you study like in the Insight tradition, like if anybody here has been to Insight Meditation Society or Spirit Rock, or maybe if you've done a mindfulness-based stress reduction course, you may have received a few Pali language words. Here's one really good example of a Pali language word, metta, M-E-T-T-A, which is most often translated as loving kindness. Okay, so that's Pali, and that's the language that the Buddha, the closest to the language that the Buddha supposedly taught in. Later on, you have Sanskrit words, and as different Buddhist academies developed in India and elsewhere, the Sanskrit words get translated more, and those tend to be the words that other traditions, later traditions, took and then either retranslated. And that's also the language that some yoga scholars use. So I tend to, if I use a word, I tend to use the Sanskrit language word, but, so the point of all this is, if there's a word that you don't know what it means, don't be afraid to ask me or your faculty point person or each other, like, hey, what does this word mean? That's the other piece of having a Sangha that's working together for 8 weeks or a whole year. We have the Facebook group, et cetera, et cetera. We can actually use each other to harvest information. So the interesting thing about the three aspects of prajna that we have here is that this is a Tibetan teaching, but prajna is a Sanskrit word. Now, why is this so important as a starting place? It's because this teaching, I think, really, as we delve into it, really describes what the whole process of practice, study, and integrating practice and study into our mind and into our lived experience looks like. And I think it's really important to sort of look at how Buddhist scholars and Buddhist masters viewed the educational process. And some of you I know on this are teachers in different formats, from elementary school to people who might teach psychotherapeutic or counseling courses, to people who teach art, etc. So you can think about how the Buddhist educational process works with other educational processes. But the three aspects of prajna as a cycle of learning that we go through every day, every year, etc., are often translated as hearing, contemplating, and meditating, or topa, sampa, and gompa in Tibetan. So I just want to talk about that. And really start with hearing. Hearing here means hearing the teachings, right? So this is interesting because where these teachings came from was oral traditions of, which is something like what we're doing tonight. A group of students and a teacher getting together and sharing ideas and receiving ideas through oral transmission of, here's what the teachings say, here's how we practice that, here's how we might resolve confusion or questions as people share their confusion and questions, or challenge the teachings or the teacher, etc. And so forth. So it's interesting because we hear these days, we have so many more means of hearing or initially receiving ideas than ever before in human history. And let's be honest. Can we be honest that probably most of us are struggling right now in some way because our devices give us too many ways of receiving information? The number of people in the last 2 years who have reported either minor or major anxiety attacks because of the news notifications on our iPhones or whatever device you have is quite a lot, right? We hear constantly. There's just this sort of ongoing sort of cheapening of the act of hearing, right? And so this is the notion in the Buddhist tradition, and it's why I think some old dogs, I saw a few comments on a few Facebook posts of people saying, you can't teach Buddhism online, which I was like, well, how are we going to do this then, you know? But I think what they were saying is it cheapens the whole experience because the transmissional quality, the environmental transmission is very important, and online is a field of cheapened hearing and seeing and receiving of information. So this brings us to one of the readings that we had for this week, which was from a 19th century Tibetan teacher named Patrul Rinpoche. Rinpoche is just the honorific title in the Tibetan tradition for a lama or a very senior teacher. This is from a larger book called The Words of My Perfect Teacher, which is a very interesting to bring into modern Western society right now, the notion that there is such a thing as a perfect teacher, right? And part of the challenges of looking at our defects as students, and I think my friend Anya brought this up already on the Facebook page, and I was really feeling this, is that the classic Buddhist approach, especially in the Tibetan system, but in other systems too, it has multiple aspects, but it often puts the impetus for confusion and clarifying confusion on the student side of things. Right? So the three defects of the pot, you could say, or the cup, I've also seen this written, are sort of ways that we as students need to check ourselves, need to contemplate, and need to think about the ways that we miss really integrating useful material.
Where's Ethan?
Ethan's back. I don't know what's happening. I don't know if it's because we have more participants, it's kicking me off. I will check this before our second class, very, very in depth. I can promise you that. Can everybody hear me now?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yes, now.
So the notion being that we need to check ourselves as students in these ways that we lose touch with really the power of integrating the teachings that we receive, right? Because the receiving of ideas, the receiving of techniques is the beginning of this path and this cycle of really developing our prajna, our discernment, our insight, our best awakened understanding. So the three defects of the pot, which do work really beautifully as an analogy, you can remember them. And that's the great thing about analogies and visual metaphors in Buddhism, is you're often like in the middle of an argument with your in-laws and you don't remember the Buddhist teaching, you just remember the imagistic analogy, and that helps you remember how you might want to shift your way of being a little bit. I don't fight at all with my in-laws. I love them completely, and they're perfect people. So the first defect is our pot is turned over, right? That we're just not, I think of this one as a sense of stubbornness. Like, I'm here, but I'm really just waiting for my turn to speak or dispute, etc. Or I'm not really here to listen first. And I've been this person a lot in my life. So there's a quality of stubbornness and a chance to contemplate the ways that we feel shut off from really challenging ourselves with a new idea, a new practice, a new teaching. The second defect of the pot, right? And this is, I think, a little bit easier to remember because there's not really a challenge in the hierarchy or the patriarchy or the student-teacher dynamic here. This is just sort of how all of our minds work. This is the pot with a hole in it, right? So it's turned upright, so it receives the teachings. It really wants to, right? This is if you ever go to a meditation talk or a Dharma talk or a yoga class or any kind of class, it's the person in the front row who's like sitting there like this. And then afterwards, I've been this person too, so I can say this. Afterwards, that doughy-eyed person says, "That was an amazing lecture. Oh my gosh, that was so amazing." And then their friend says to them, "So what was it about?" And you can't remember anything. Has anybody ever been the pot with a hole in it? I hope so. So one of the practices that really works here is, as we are working with a certain level of hearing, which is conceptual knowledge in a sense, not to become total intellectual in our heads, cut off from our emotions and our bodies, because we're going to talk in depth about emotions next week, but to reflect on what we've received, to memorize, right? So it would be great if everybody next week could at least memorize the three defects of the pot, which I'm going to turn into four defects of the pot, and the three prajnas, right? As a way to work with the cup with a hole in it, right? And then the third defect, I always find this a little bit trickier, which is the third defect is the cup that is turned upright and doesn't have a hole in it, but has some kind of poisonous residue in it. And so when the new teachings or new ideas are joined with this cup, that mixes with a poisonous bias that isn't actually healthy to ingest, right? So we all do this in subtle ways, right? There's certain aspects of the teachings of Buddhism that are incredibly liberating and joyous, but they are also, in many ways, and we'll get to a deep conversation on this, threatening to our current sense of who I think I need to be in the world, right? And that who I think I need to be, especially if you're an intelligent person, can really play a lot of subtle games defending itself, you know. So we all come with certain biases. Maybe the bias is just as simple as like feeling like I do not like being an intellectual student. I'm more an embodied emotive student. And that's going to stop us from wanting to do a lot of reading or memorization, which you don't have to do a lot of, or more intellectual pursuits in this course. Or maybe the bias is I'm brilliant, you know. I mean, you wouldn't say it, you know. I'm a phenomenal scholar. Who calls themselves phenomenal? It's really amazing. It's amazing that worked. So maybe you should try it if you're internally saying, no. I've already heard a talk on the, yes, that's right. Somebody, that was my joke. Somebody, Tech Life to Everyone, whoever that is in real life, said Trump does. And that was, yes, you spoke the subtext in the chat form. But maybe we feel like I don't really need to learn anything else. In fact, I've already studied the three prajnas, and I'm just doing this because my friend was doing it, and I just, you know, want to have conversations with them over coffee about what I know about the relationship between Buddhism and evolutionary biology and neuroscience and my trip to the Himalayas, etc. Right? So we all have our subtle poisons. And the other thing I think that's so important about this one, and I'll say this with the challenge of putting all of this weight on the student to check themselves in this teaching by Patrul Rinpoche, we also have poisonous biases from our society, you know, about which can work in many different directions. You know, I do think it's important that people who look like me, white, cisgendered, straight males in the United States, middle class in New York City, actually understand the way that culture might bias me to say, you know what, I could do Buddhism. I could do it. But I've also seen cultural biases in Buddhist spaces that work in a different direction. Like maybe because I'm a Western person, I can't really wake up, you know. It's only the Vietnamese masters like Thich Nhat Hanh and the Tibetan lamas like the Dalai Lama or Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche or somebody like that who's really awakened. And the best I can do is sort of achieve this functional level of neurosis. And that's why I'm here, right? I just want to make my neurosis a little more functional. And that's also a kind of poison. It's the poison of a lack of self-confidence that can mix with the teachings that we receive. So all of this is just a contemplation of like, what are our biases as we receive teachings? Now, I gave this same lecture about 10 or so years ago, and I really thought that there was a fourth defect of the cup, which again represents our willingness to receive teachings and practices and work with them ourselves as a student. And I came up with then this sort of witty play that the fourth defect of the cup or the pot is drinking out of someone else's cup, right? Not enough appreciation of your own wisdom, your own eccentricity, your own personal and social and cultural experience. And this is actually literal to me because there's this weird bias in social circles that Buddhist people don't drink coffee. like, it's like, what kind of tea do Buddhists like? It's one of the weirder biases. But I drink coffee, right? And when I receive the teachings, I receive them in a coffee cup, and that's my cup. And it's okay to make those choices. And so that's one way of pushing back against this idea of the hearing teachings process as being just on the student, right? Which is really problematic when we look at what's going on in the Western world with the issues of strict patriarchy, et cetera. And when we look at what's going on in these different Tibetan communities, Shambhala is not far from the only one in these different Zen communities of teachers who've seem to have taken advantage of students trying to turn themselves into pristine, empty cups to just receive blindly whatever is poured in, right? This cup has eyes, and it has heart, and it has its own wisdom, but it is trying to receive something before it just turns it into whatever it wanted it to be, right? So there's a balancing in hearing of humility and confidence, and taking the time to really receive. So just to push us in a little bit of a different direction from where Patrul Rinpoche takes us, I wanted to share a quote from the Buddha, actually. And this is from a sutra. Sutra is a Sanskrit word, sutta in Pali, which means discourse. Many of you know. This is called the Ganavyuha Sutra, the Sutra of Dense Array, where he tells people how to receive his teachings. And he says it completely differently from the way Patrul Rinpoche says it. So this is the other thing about studying Buddhism. You often receive ideas from masters in quotes that don't seem like they immediately go together. And they're balancing out sort of, I feel like all these teachings are balancing out not too tight, not too loose, humble yet confident, etc. So here's what the Buddha said. O bhikshus and wise men, bhikshus means monks. O bhikshus and wise men, just as a goldsmith would test his gold by burning, cutting, and rubbing it, basically beating the gold, so you must examine my words and accept them, not merely out of reverence for me. So if what I'm saying is true, beat the crap out of it through your practice first, and then see if it's actually gold, right? So this is interesting to put these two things together as we look at just how we are hearing teachings, you know, what our personal biases are. And I really want to note that most people I work with, our personal bias tends to be some aspect of not having enough confidence in our own wisdom, right? So that's hearing. And the next stage on this process is contemplating. So contemplating means putting it to the test. It means thinking about it, bringing it up in the midst of life. I'm seeing a question saying, will there be show notes? We're not planning to share my or the faculty's notes from each class, but all of these recordings are going to be available to you. So you're going to be able to go back and either get the audio or the video recordings. So contemplating means putting to the test what we are learning. And putting it into practice, thinking about it, receiving other bits of information, talking to our friends about it. Maybe that's the quad function for those of us in the live course. But working with things as an ongoing play. These ideas are in play. Our practice is in play, right? Whenever somebody says, what am I supposed to be experiencing in practice? It's like, well, you're supposed to be experiencing your experience. That's what mindfulness means. And holding that in a loving environment, but put these ideas in play, right? So if it seems like a struggle to say, if it seems like a struggle to really think about your own obstacles as a student, maybe we just need to talk to other people about their obstacles, right? So contemplation is really where I think being a student happens. It's like the person who's eating and breathing this stuff. And I'm not expecting you to become that person, but I sort of became that person. And if you could become that person a little bit, it's really helpful. And there are formal contemplative practices as well, where we actually direct our thoughts in a meditative environment or journal, or we actually are asked questions and answer them, or we argue with the answers, etc. All of these are ways to contemplate. And then the third aspect of prajna, which is really the settling aspect of this cycle of learning, is the meditative experience. The crucialness of actually taking that mind, and you might feel yourself right now, your energy is going to your head a lot. That's how mine feels. Taking all of that and taking the good grinding of the thought process and then bringing it back into our body. Right? So let's just take 1 minute to find our breath together. You don't have to get into any posture. Just come back to this space of settling into your body, since that's the technique we're working with. Feel your breath. Remember this notion of awareness as a sort of loving parent. Okay. So this cycle of hearing, contemplating, and meditating can also be thought of as the cycle of practice and study. And each time we go through a cycle, we come back and then we receive something new, which could mean reading something. It could mean reading something new. It could mean a new discussion, a new conversation. It could mean a new experience in life. And we come back and we contemplate and then we meditate. And from this standpoint, meditation is not just the formal practice of meditation. Meditation is the process of taking a view of reality and bringing it into our experience. Right? That's the aspect of the Buddhist teachings, is that we are working with our worldview and our view of ourself. And sometimes people think that that study aspect is too intellectual, but that's actually another view, right? The idea that views are too intellectual is another view. And so this cycle allows us to both use head and heart in unison, and then the next day arises. And there's a fourth part that I added to the cycle, which is our actions in the world, right? Which could be considered another form of hearing, because you get feedback from the world, right? Sometimes you don't get feedback from the world, but a lot of times we do get feedback from the world, and that's like, okay, how am I doing here? And then that starts the cycle again. So I love this notion of looking at the learning process day by day in terms of hearing, contemplating, and meditating. So if hearing, contemplating, and meditating is practice and study, that's 2/3 of the Buddhist path. We'll talk about that when we get deep into the Four Noble Truths and the Eightfold Path. And the third is our ethical conduct in our life. How we speak, how we listen, how we treat ourselves, how we treat others, where the rubber meets the road. I would say that the ethical conduct is the most important part of the path. But without practice and study, it becomes pretty unanchored. So that's all I want to add for tonight until we get to our closing contemplation, which will just be a reflection on the words of the Buddha and our own maybe experience of ourselves as a student so far in life. But I just wanted to leave a little time, 20 or so minutes for discussion, for Q&A. And remember that we'll also have those of us in the live course discussion on the Facebook group. We can have discussion in our quads. There's going to be a portion of Saturday afternoons, Eastern time, that's dedicated to discussion. But if anybody wants to ask a question or just weigh in with your own experience, please feel free. And Hunt, I see that Hunt is using the chat box, but Hunt, do you want to jump on the mic and just ask your question? Would that be easier at this point?
Sure. Hi, everybody. I was just curious exactly how we were defining prajna in this context. I was taught both wisdom and insight, and I was just looking at it in the context of the three hearing, contemplating, and meditating offerings that we just broke down. Yeah, great. Wonderful question. So prajna, there's two parts to that word. In Tibetan, the word is sherab or sherap. So jna, my understanding, J-N-A, is the root of the word that means knowing, right? Like knowing. And pra means something like highest. So I think the most literal translation of the word, either in Sanskrit or Tibetan, my limited understanding, is like best knowing. So this sometimes gets translated as wisdom. This also gets translated, I like the translation, which a few of you may have heard, discernment. Because there's a sense of being able to separate what is true from what is not and integrate that into our experience from this. I haven't heard insight. The Sanskrit word that most directly relates to insight is vipassana, or clear seeing sometimes. Yeah, so my understanding of breaking down the word is that the best way of looking at it is best knowing, or the most direct way of translating is best knowing, but it's often translated as wisdom as well. Can you spell words if you don't have them written down in PowerPoint? Now, isn't prajna written on the thing that I shared? Is it unshared now? Sorry, I'm just getting used to this larger format platform. So prajna is P-R-A-J-N-A. And I'm going to add another reading from Ponlop Rinpoche about that as well. Yes, Michelle is spelling the word vipassana, which is the Pali word for Vipassana. Yes. Oh, the original language is P-A-L-I is usually how it's spelled. P-A-L-I. So I'll do that on the chat. And I'm not the only one who knows these things. The faculty knows a lot of these things, and a lot of the beautiful geeks online know these things too. So we can harvest wisdom from each other. So yeah, best knowing. Yeah. Any thoughts on sort of, or anyone, I'm wondering, and nobody has to, but does anyone want to share, if you've read the Patrul Rinpoche, you know, what thoughts that brought up for you as a student, or anything related to that? It's very interesting to contemplate how we've shown up as a student, and yeah, I'll say a little bit more about that to answer Anya's beautiful Facebook post as well, perhaps. But I see. So Lucy is asking, could you talk a little about drinking from someone else's cup? So for me, that just means that there's a lot of things going on here, and it's tricky because these are traditions that flourished until about 45, 50 years ago in Asia. So there's a cultural component. Every place that Buddhism has gone as a psychological and spiritual tradition, it's integrated itself with the culture and society there and taken on different shapes, right? So a lot of what we've inherited is teachings that were mixtures of ideas about human mind and human interrelatedness mixed with a cultural history and a ceremonializing of a culture that may look different in a new place, right? So that's the first part, is that the willingness to be discerning about how we separate, like, what is the awakened mind teaching here, and what is the cultural aspect that I may have a different cultural aspect. I use the example of, I drink coffee. And it's okay to be a Buddhist and drink coffee. That's a fairly innocuous example. Now, at the same time, I think we have to be careful of, and I think this metaphor saves it. The other aspect is the aspect of using Buddhism as a kind of cultural appropriation, right? That this is just a bunch of Westerners, up until this point in history, mostly white Westerners, who are saying, like, the cool new psychology or the cool new spirituality, or those who consider it a religion. I'm not one of those. The cool new religion is Buddhism. So let's take it and let's, you know, buy some Tibetan prayer flags, you know, or I'm going to Zen out my home a little bit, and just to feel that vibe, right? That could be moving too far in the other direction of cultural appropriation. So I think it's really looking at what's authentic to us about our practice, and what's authentic to us about our culture, while still having a real desire to be a student of where all these things are coming from, and understanding a little bit of history and context around that. So that's what I meant by drinking from someone else's cup. Yeah. So where does meditation fit into the process? Great question. Great question. Why do we meditate? Can we get out of that part? Can I just read the books? Can I just contemplate? Right. The meditation is where my friend Dr. Miles Neal likes to call it the flight simulator. And the flight simulator has a sense of where we really test out on our own experience, right? So like we say, like people say like, oh, no, mindfulness is really important, right? I actually got to do a interview for when I co-hosted this series of online lectures and interviews for Sounds True with Dan Siegel, who's both a developmental psychologist and a great mindfulness teacher. And he talked about the view and led me to contemplate a lot about how a child's developing neural network has everything to do with a parent or caretaker's ability to just be present with the child. So that freaked me out a little bit about the times I'm not quite able to be present. But it could just be a brilliant idea of like, and a lot of people I think are taking like, oh, mindfulness doesn't mean meditation, right? I don't know if anybody's familiar with this, but there's a whole aspect of the mindfulness movement in different psychotherapies that does not, and other sort of lifestyle brands where mindfulness does not mean meditation. And I think meditation is where we take the view of mindfulness, if we're talking about shamatha meditation, or there are meditations on confidence or loving kindness meditation, is where we take the contemplation of loving kindness and say, how do I actually integrate this into my experience, right? Before I talk about how important mindfulness is with my students or clients, can I actually sit with myself and work with the various discomforts that come up there? So meditation is really where we ingrain the view and intention that come from the study related to hearing and contemplating teachings. So it's everything. And if it's not important, it would be very, very easy to do. The fact that it's hard to meditate means that there must be some working through a way of relating to how our conceptual mind relates to our experiential body and mind that's crucial to this whole educational process. So I'm seeing Meredith saying, what if the cultural trappings related back to the not drinking from someone else's cup provide comfort, stability, and practice? I think that's great. What's wrong with that? I think that's yours. I think that we can each decide for ourselves what our own cup looks like, and it might evolve over time. But I also think we're about empowering ourselves and our own authenticity along this path. And for me, actually, a lot of the Asian or Tibetan symbolism, when I think about why it's meaningful to me, it's either because the context of studying it brings out a story, because I'm really interested in storytelling, that is relatable or interesting to me. Or it's because it makes me think of a teacher who I really feel, or a sangha, or a place that I feel personally connected to. So, I think that these teachings and these practices are difficult enough that it's okay to have a little comfort. So, if you want to put a classic bodhisattva, the saint figures of Buddhism, up on your meditation altar to give you that enriched environment for practice, or you want to buy a mala, garland beads, and have it blessed by a Tibetan Lama, and that's really important to you, and that feels personal, please do it. If you want to put Papa Smurf on your shrine, or I don't know, who would you want to put on your shrine? Or your meditation altar. It's up to you. It's meant to be somebody. Freddie Mercury, thank you. Yeah. Tina Turner, awesome. I hope you guys actually do that. Wonderful, right? So it's it's really about finding that balance between humbling ourselves to receiving something and confidence in our own experience. And don't be afraid to choose comfort. These practices are hard enough, you know. But if it's comfort that never questions itself, then that's not going to help us wake up, right? Yeah. This is so that I wish we could publish, even though we're practicing confidentiality outside of this group. I just wish we could publish a little bit from the chat box, because I feel like it's probably going to get better and better as we go on. So trying to see if I missed a question.
Can I speak?
Yes. Yeah, please,
okay.
you speak, and then Michelle, and then I'm going to address the leaky cup question after this. So yes, I can hear you, Michelle. Please go ahead.
Oh, okay. Can you hear me now?
Yes, I can.
Okay, I just put my earphones back in. Well, I wanted to say something that some other people are bringing up in the chat about the leaky cup that I just realized. So I've been studying Buddhism for a couple years, and I noticed that I just want to keep reading books over and over again. And yet, like, I'll read a book and I read your book, The Road Home, and then I just started to read it again, and I didn't remember any of the introduction that I had actually read it before. And then my ability to put into practice what I'm reading and I guess complete that cycle is so much more limited than my ability. Like, I'll just want to keep taking in information, but then the amount of that I can integrate into my life is maybe like 1%. Yeah. And so just recognizing that, which I've kind of recognized, but I recognize it more after hearing this lecture, and then how to balance that with a pretty rigorous syllabus that we have, which I'm attracted to, but already I'm starting to think that there's like I don't know, it's tough to integrate.
Yeah, for sure. Thanks for sharing that. I saw Jackie has a similar question, and just saw Dan posted same issue. I think this is a lot of our issues, and I've noticed this issue too in myself, especially the last couple of years. I don't know if it's hitting my 40s, or if it's being more sleep deprived, being a parent than previously at my life. Yes, fatherhood. It's probably multiple things, but that I used to have, like, when it came to memorization, I don't mean to brag, but I had a good cup, like at least didn't have leaks, you know? And there used to be a little bit of braggadocio almost about being able to, like, remember teachings, you know, like at one point there's a text which is in verse form called the 37 Practices of the Bodhisattva. And I memorized the whole thing, and it's like, who cares? But that has gotten a little bit leakier for me. And also my ability to care about, like, that being the, like I don't want to be the guy who can memorize texts and is a jerk to people, you know? So it's not the most important part of all this at all. And definitely I think my, what has been important for me has shifted a little bit around that. But what I would say, so the first thing I want to say is that the ambitious nature of the syllabus is for people to choose, and I'm going to keep offering people, and I think people are going to share with each other more readings or more resources. That's just to offer study and readings, resources, so that it gives us a little bit of a desire to be together and to practice meditation and to be part of a Sangha in this online form, which is not quite as good as if we could all get together in person, but is way better than having nothing. So that's the reason for the ambitious syllabus. Do as much or as little of it as you would like. I'm much more interested in people establishing or reestablishing a reasonable regular meditation schedule with this course, like 3-4 times a week or more, 10 to 30 minutes. Like if your pot is leaky but you're meditating, it's less messy. Let's put it that way. So what I'll say is memorization is a really good practice, but keep the memorization simple. So that's why I said, will everybody memorize the 3 prajnas and the 3 or 4 defects of the pot? Just practice that. And if you can't remember them, that's completely fine. If you don't remember the introduction to The Road Home, who cares? I mean, seriously, that's not the most important thing. So I think we often have leaky pots, and this is the one in the sort of noticing how much of this felt like sort of culturally challenging, especially with this moment about how the student shows up. This one felt the least culturally challenging and just felt more like cognitive. You know, it's just like, wow, it's hard to remember what we're trying to do sometimes. So, you know, memorize the simple teachings and maybe geek out, like sharing them, you know, share them with your partners or your friends or your cats, or, you know, those of you who are single and I'm living vicariously through the experience of like what it's like to be that person. Share it with the person you're going out on a date with, you know, I don't know, but I'll share it with my wife, you know, she'll have to listen to me just reciting teachings because she's very patient. So she'll do that. But let's just see what sticks. And if it doesn't stick, again, this is just to keep us in the ballpark of working with our mind with compassion. So that's really, I think, all there is to say about that. And if you have a leaky cup, that's very much very normal. And if you have a pot with poison in it, probably probably our poison, most of us that I know it's not universal, because some of us may have, you know, there is the narcissistic end of the spectrum, but most of our poison is going to be lack of confidence in our own ability and our own wisdom. So pay attention to that one. Pay attention to the idea of like, I can't wake up. So I hope that's helpful, but memorize simple things, just lists of 3, and make that part of your struggle, you know? Let's see. Oh, Kevin's question above. Okay. The responsibilities of the student to subject the teacher to such scrutiny. How does the student address the fact that the teacher is human and fallible? Ultimately, how do we know when we're following a good enough teacher? Good. Thank you for that. There's different commitments of a student-teacher relationship. There's in one way of looking at it, and the way that I look at it in The Road Home, and maybe we'll spend a whole night in our 3rd course actually talking about the student-teacher relationship, really going in depth. But there's different levels of commitment. The first role of the teacher, and how I'm manifesting right now, and how our faculty will mostly manifest in this, is the instructor, right? So the person who's holding our experience and providing teachings and ideas and information, but it's sort of a one-way street a little bit, right? So in this environment, there's a sense of like a more activated receiving or hearing and contemplating and meditating process going on. but nobody is committed to me or faculty as a teacher here. Then there's a kind of teacher in my tradition, which is called the Kalyana Mitra, or the spiritual mentor. And this is how I work with some students. This is an actual personal relationship that's entered into, where there is a sense of being with a good enough teacher who is human and fallible, and who kind of shares their own process with the teachings, and you share yours. But there's an actual relationship and some initial level of commitment. Usually with the Kalyana Mitra, there's not a major commitment. And then in the Tibetan system, there's a third level of teacher, which is where this question that Kevin is asking and that's being echoed is the most important, is the guru relationship. I am not a guru. This is a relationship that is echoed in other Buddhist traditions too. Like, I know there are certain Zen masters who work with their students. They wouldn't call themselves gurus, but as gurus. And this is a much more committed, lifelong relationship where there is a sense that the teacher is supposedly coming to represent one's link to the awakened state of mind. And we'll get into more, for those of us who might be interested in tantric traditions, how this works much later on in the course. But this is the one where scrutiny, I think, is the most important. And in any sense, I think there's a clear sense of understanding the mutual responsibility, right, of what is the relationship. And I think people get into trouble, and I'm talking about teachers get into trouble, because they haven't clarified with the students what the mutual responsibilities of the relationship are and what the boundaries of that relationship are. And so therefore, there's a lot of projection and a lot of manipulation that can happen in that spaces where relationship and boundaries are not clear. I've always, if you're looking for teachers, and maybe we will help each other sort of find other paths or other curriculum or other lineages that we want to connect with out of this Sangha. I always think that one of the qualities I really look for, at least in mentors, and this has been part of my struggle with very credible allegations coming up against my guru, is a person who's transparent, who seems transparent. Like, they're just willing to share who they are, and they're not lying about it. And they're sharing their own flaws. They're not pretending to be perfect. As soon as a teacher needs to represent perfection, I think they're setting themselves up for a bad situation. So I think it's also just a personal connection, but yeah, if you're asking about how you find a good enough instructor, then I hope this feels good enough, and if not, we have a certain level of ability to check out different things. That's the beauty of the modern age, is if your mind is stable, you can hear teachings constantly. The problem is that we need a good container and a good environment to actually receive teachings. Maybe before we have a brief closing contemplation, I just want to, if any member of the faculty who's on just wants to say a brief word or two, maybe just let one or two of you say if there's anything that's on your mind, or just say hello to folks.
This is Meredith. Can you hear me?
I can. You cut out for a moment, but I can hear you.
Okay. Hi, this is Meredith. There's two of us. I'm Meredith on faculty. And I'm here. I'm talking to you from Seattle. This is the largest Zoom call I've ever been on. I'm really excited to be helping out with this course. So welcome everyone. And I think I'm leading Saturday's group, so I bet I will see some of you there. Thanks.
Thank you, Meredith.
Hi, I'm Ellen. I'm in New York and Manhattan as well. This is also the largest Zoom call I've ever been. A couple of them Buddhist study Zoom calls in the Tibetan tradition, but this one with more than 100 people is really amazing and exciting. I'm super excited to be helping as an assistant faculty with Ethan. And Ethan, I remember 10 years ago when you were talking about the fourth kind of cup. So it was just so exciting to me to see this continuity of teaching and meet all these new people. So thanks.
Thank you, Ellen.
Hi, I'm Gala. Can you hear me? Yeah, from New York City, and also super excited to be a part of this course. And I've was thinking about the idea of a crazy big Zoom call like this, and just in the last week or two, I've had a whole series of Zoom calls, workshops, and where there's been such an amazing level of intimacy and real incredible conversation and sharing. And so it's a very exciting new era where we can do this. So I am interested in all the possibility of doing this class online with everyone. So nice to meet you all.
Hi, this is Maho Kawachi. I'm from New York, but today I'm in Troy, New York, which is upstate near Albany. And nice to meet you all. And it's amazing to see over 100 people online at the same time. It's almost like a congregation or something like that, which is great. I'm looking forward to study and practice with you more. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me? Great. And
So we have a little code word for meditation in our quads that says that we have meditated that day. And then just a little note about how our day is going or what we're up to. The quads could also pose questions to your faculty point person if there's things you want brought up in the Tuesday and Saturday discussions. The quads could also meet together in an online hangout space, or if you're in the same place, you could meet up. And people use the quads differently, but I'd ask you to just report your practice to your quad for the time being. Just when you meditate, just write a 1 or 2 line email to your quad. And if you want to articulate further than that, that's fine. But it could just be as simple as meditated, now I'm going to work, etc. So just ask you to start using your quads as a support and accountability mechanism for your daily practice. So there's much to contemplate coming out of tonight, and I just want to take a moment as we close to just want to take a moment to go back to the 4 defects of the pot, and just with that sense of humble confidence, just reflect on which one resonated with you the most. So was it being the turned over cup? Was it being the leaky cup, which seemed to resonate with a lot of us? Was it being the cup with poison in it? A particular way that we filter or confuse our experience, such as self-denigration or some other poison? Or is it the feeling like I haven't really found my own authentic relationship to practice and being a student yet, drinking from someone else's cup? And just see if we can set an intention to work with the one that resonates the most for us. And then I'm just going to ask you to contemplate, and you don't have to answer this yet, but a meditation plan for the coming week. So you can meditate for 10 to 30 minutes. You can meditate for 5 minutes, but that's negotiating. And I would say go for at least 3 times this week. I'm a big fan of setting reasonable expectations, right? So if I said I'm going to meditate every day this week and then I only meditated 5 times, I feel like a failure. But if I said I'm going to meditate 3 times this week and then I meditate 5 times, I owe myself a dessert, a milkshake. So come up with a reasonable expectation for your practice, and let's just commit to that for this week. And if you want to seal your practice with a bow as the gong rings to close, feel free. Thank you all so much. It's going to be fun to work together. I did see the question, did everybody receive their quad groupings? Some of us faculty did have a chance to reach out to our groupings today. A few of us haven't, so you'll hear tomorrow if you didn't hear today. And we'll get these little tech glitches worked out before next week as well. And the recording, which might be in 2 pieces now because of me being knocked off, will be up before day's end tomorrow. So have a wonderful night or a wonderful evening if you're on the West Coast, and rest well. Okay, bye-bye.